Most, if not all of us, know about the death of young rapper Juice WRLD in 2019. But few, if any of us, know about the car accident which killed an entire band in the same year. Why do we know about one and not the other? Probably because one was signed to a major record label with artists such as 5 Seconds of Summer, Eminem, and Billie Eilish, while the other was signed to a small independent label. In these past few years, we've seen a rapid growth of indie culture through the spread of indie music. The songs that we listen to and get stuck in our heads or we play as background music are a part of the most rapidly growing music industry. And the indie music industry is changing the overall music industry, from the distribution of music to no longer needing a record label to be successful. A change is being seen. Sammy and I, motivated by our interest in indie music and the culture which comes with it, have spent our time researching the past and present of this culture, and we're ready to inform you on what we've learned. Today, Sammy and I will be informing you on the co-culture of indie. I'll give you an overview of the history of the indie culture and the values associated with it, while Sammy will teach you about the current trends of indie culture and how the media has been affecting it. Traditionally, calling something indie simply meant it was independent from what would be considered normal. But this term has shifted and morphed over time to hold different meanings. The music genre, indie, originated in England as early 80s artists started publishing their music under independent record labels. In Wendy Fornera's book, Empire of Dirt, which details the culture surrounding British indie music, she points out how the music produced by these early artists became the type of music associated with the term indie. This music ranged from alternative into punk, and some of it was even considered pop. In the United States, indie music was not originally called indie music. What we would consider alternative rock was what they considered indie music, until the 90s, when the alternative rock community experienced a divide. Some artists signed to major labels, and the other artists remained independent. Those who signed to major labels laid the basis for what we consider modern-day alternative rock, and the independent artists became known as underground artists, but were eventually labeled indie artists. Similar to England, the music created by these indie artists, it was associated with the term indie. We have modeled our understanding of indie music from these artists, and as the music industry of indie grew, the overarching term indie became applicable to nearly all forms of indie music. We see this in indie pop, indie punk, indie rock, and even indie folk music. While the term indie has changed over time, values surrounding the culture of indie have remained rather constant. It's in the name. It's independent from the mainstream culture. This independence is expressed in a multitude of ways across different platforms. In his article, Indie Culture, Michael Z. Newman highlights cultural aspects associated with the creators and the consumers of indie movies, and how this culture translates into other subgenres of indie, such as indie music. He argues that the indie scene is no longer independent as it had once been, but it still strives to be authentic in its disassociation from the common culture. It can be assumed that indie culture strives to turn against all that is mainstream, but actually, indies really value challenging norms while progressing pre-existing parts of society. It is this mindset that makes for such an expansive, rapidly growing music culture, and these values are really enticing and inviting to so many different types of people. Additionally, and equally important, are the values of authenticity and integrity. These two values are closely associated with each other and can be found at the root of nearly every piece of indie creation. One of the main reasons indie artists strive to be disconnected from the common culture is so that they could have and maintain authenticity. It is important for indie creations to be authentic in every aspect. In order to maintain such a high level of authenticity, artists feel that they can't sign to any form of a major label, as these labels have the power to alter the music created by the artist signed to them. If indie artists allow this to happen, they are largely rejected by other members of the indie community. And sacrificing authenticity is giving up integrity. And without those things, a work is not considered indie. Instead of catering to the mainstream culture to make an extra buck or two, indie music is held to a standard of authenticity and simply being the music you want to create. I've given you a look into the indie culture. Now Sammy will inform you on how this culture has evolved into what we see today as indie culture.
Today, indie music has become much more popular and accessible through the growth of technology and streaming platforms. As Emily explained, indie culture strives to not be considered mainstream. However, this was much easier for artists to accomplish when we didn't have essentially all music at the tip of our fingers. In the article, The Evolution of Indie Music, Swara Garg explains that now anyone who owns a smartphone has immediate access to the latest released music. Since streaming platforms didn't exist during the rise of indie rock, it was a lot easier to keep it away from mainstream pop culture. However, today, the unlimited access to different artists has led to indie music becoming a lot more popularized than it was in the past. While lots of indie musicians still record music outside of a large record label, they still have access to the same platforms as any other artist. Opposed to a few decades ago, when you had to book a studio in order to record music, lots of artists now can create music from a small home studio, allowing them to still reach the same recognition as huge celebrities without joining a record label. The process of creating and releasing this music has become much quicker for people recording at home than those in studios, which ends up actually favoring them due to their release of music quickly. This has led to a large increase in the recognition and popularity of indie culture as a whole. In 2012, the US Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that there was a 71% increase in indie artists since 2003. This goes hand in hand with the idea that the rise of music platforms have increased the genre's popularity, given that iTunes was released in 2001 and Spotify in 2008. So, not only has the popularity of indie music increased throughout the years, but this popularity has even affected the overall sound and style of the genre. Like Emily described, the indie scene, when it first began, was an alternative rock genre of music. However, today, it seems we associate indie music with more of a pop sound due to its increasing popularity. It seems that the umbrella term of indie has majorly shifted. When you look up the indie genre on music platforms like Spotify or Apple Music, rather than seeing what you would see about 20 years ago, which would be a lot more rock-focused artists, the term indie has been generalized to indie pop. This can even be seen in the culture shift from 90s indie bands to indie bands today. If we put these two decades side by side, there's an apparent shift in style, which also consequently led to a shift in music as well. A very substantial part of defining any internet culture these days comes from social media. So it makes sense that lots of music trends today now come from platforms such as YouTube, TikTok, and a lot of other social media platforms. In the article from UC Santa Barbara, TikTok, A Cultural Reset of Popularizing Indie Music, Tam Lee explains how the use of indie songs among TikTok users effortlessly exposes people to new forms of music through the platform. Since pretty much any person can go viral on the app, lots of users may be exposed to different subcultures through a variety of different videos. So the different styles, music, and trends people see through YouTube videos or other social media platforms can heavily affect the trait of indie culture. Now, everyone should have a better understanding of the history of indie music along with the culture that comes with it. We have explained the history of indie music along with some of its major ideals and values, the transition of the culture that it is today, and some modern interpretation through social media. So next time you open an indie playlist on Spotify, you'll now remember why we even have indie music in the first place.